Hey guys, I'm Kristen Howerton with Rage Against the Minivan.
I'm Elizabeth Esther from elizabethesther.com.
And you are watching So Totally Relidge, our weekly webcast where we talk about different hot topics in the religious community that we've heard about from the blogosphere. So this week we wanted to talk a little bit about sexual abuse in the church. It has been designated sexual abuse, I don't know, some kind of awareness week.
Yeah, spiritual abuse awareness
spiritual
week.
abuse
last
awareness week.
Uh-huh.
Okay. So a lot of people have been talking
Yes.
about sexual abuse within the church. Lots of posts about that, and one of the big topics that we're hearing about is there is a church, actually a network of churches called Sovereign Grace Ministries. They have recently been sued by a member or a bunch of members of their congregation for not only sexual abuse, but there's allegations that the church then covered up that sexual abuse. Did you read about this? So apparently they're alleging that when the abuse was brought to light, the officials in the church, rather than going to the authorities, as church leaders are mandated to do, they dealt with it within the church, and they had the members meet with their perpetrators to offer forgiveness and just sort of dealt with it all within internally. Thoughts?
Unfortunately, this is very common. This is what happened in my church growing up. Was
In the Catholic church?
Well, yes, it happens in the Catholic church and also in the church I grew up in.
Good times.
So yeah, it's everywhere. It's
Yeah.
everywhere, and it's this really, really scary underlying belief that we deal with this. We know we know how to deal with our own, and we don't need to report this as a crime. And you see that happen in the Catholic Church all the time, where these all these files would come forward, and instead of reporting the priest to the police, they would move him to a different parish, or in the church I grew up in, there was all kinds of domestic violence going on, and even when there were restraining orders in place, the pastor wasn't put on leave, or so there's this idea that you go first to your spiritual leader, even in the case of a crime being committed. Where does that come from?
Well, I think two things. I think one is people are looking to avoid embarrassment and scandal, which is not helpful to the people. And then I think also sometimes churches have this sort of toxic spiritual belief that they will handle any of the punitive aspects within the church, as opposed to going and making sure that they are reported by law as a criminal. So we'll just handle the punishment and we'll extend forgiveness. So I think it's just like, again, spiritual abuse, this weird spiritual
Well, and it comes from,
idea.
there's this, I remember like us being told, well, the Bible tells us if you have an offense against a brother, bring one witness with you. If he doesn't listen to you, bring two witnesses. And there was this idea like we have been given a way to deal with this biblically. You do not bring your brother to court. You do not go to the authorities with this. You deal with it in a scriptural, biblical way. Unfortunately, what happens is it really does end up re-victimizing the victims again, because instead of actually justice being served, it's like what you said, they're being called and asked to forgive their perpetrators.
Well, and that scripture that you referenced, I've always thought of that as being more of a grievance level offense.
Yes.
If your brother has offended you in some way. I don't think that we have anything in scripture that tells us not to, follow the law of the land.
In fact, it says to follow the law of the land.
And to, have people be punished by the legal system or the court system. But I completely agree, it re-victimizes. But what it also does is, it avoids getting these people in the criminal system so that they have no record. So that if they go to the next church, they're not noted in Megan's law that we have in California, or any other kind of sexual abuse registry. They can just keep going on and on and on and re-victimizing people.
And it protects the people that are already in power.
Yes.
So it avoids that, there's so much like image control that goes on in some of these groups where we want to do anything to preserve our image to the world, rather than, just being honest, which, it really does. I mean, when you cover it up, it will come out in some way or another, and that's always worse. And
it's just so unhealthy.
It is so unhealthy.
I mean, I just think it's really important for people within the church and for church leaders to get to know the laws.
Get to know the law.
And, you know, almost every state requires clergy to be a mandated reporter, which means you have to break confidentiality.
Right.
And what's funny is Sovereign Grace Ministries, in response to the suit that was brought against them, are claiming that they have the First Amendment right.
I read that.
Not to respond because of the separation of church and state. But that does not apply.
Right.
Because that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about some criminal behavior.
Criminal actions.
Yeah. But I think it's really important for people to know when you suspect child abuse, it is not on you to prove it, and it is not on you to forgive and adjudicate.
Right.
That when you suspect child abuse, you call the National Registry for Child Abuse and you report it, and then they can handle it.
Right.
And then what happens is a social worker comes in, and you know, the legal system comes in, and that whole thing can run its course in an appropriate way with professionals who know how to deal with that stuff.
I can't even tell you how many since times I would sit through these meetings where like people who are so clearly unqualified to deal with these sort of criminal behaviors.
Yeah. Well,
you
and
know,
psychological too.
Yes.
Yeah.
Acting as experts in an area where they just had no clue whatsoever. And really ended up re-victimizing and re-injuring and just making it so much worse and so much more difficult.
Well, and what you're talking about is another pet peeve of mine, is that pastors think not only will they be the criminal system, but that they will be the mental health practitioners. And it's like, unless you have been to graduate school for psychology, you're out of your league to deal with sexual abuse and the ramifications psychologically of sexual abuse. I mean, to me, that's like a pastor saying, well, you know, I've been to seminary, so if you need open heart surgery, I'll do it for you. Right. You know, that doesn't make you qualified. Yes, there are spiritual components, but the psychological stuff is way outside of the scope of a minister.
And unfortunately, they act as if they are doctors and lawyers and judges and any other manner, law enforcement. I mean, I guess if God calls you, he has also given you the skills to handle.
Well, I have to share this story because, you know, we're talking about a lot of the negativity that happens in churches. Well, first of all, I do want to say the caveat. I don't believe that sexual abuse happens more often in churches than any other setting where there are children. I think perpetrators are everywhere. At schools, at sporting events. I think, unfortunately, though, the rate of cover-up is a bit higher in the church. That having been said, just to give a good example, because not every church is covering it up. We, unfortunately, in my church did have a sexual abuse situation. There was a youth group leader who was discovered to be a perpetrator, and he was actually discovered in something totally unrelated to the church, but it became known to the church staff that he'd been arrested for pedophilia. And so the church, what my church did was that they called a meeting with all of the parents of any kid who'd had contact with them and said, hey, this guy was at our church. You all need to go home and have a frank conversation with your children. That happened. And unfortunately, there were some children within my church who he had acted out on. And my church immediately called the police. And then what they did is they had a huge meeting and they brought in licensed therapists to be available to talk with the church. So I feel like that's the model. You know, it's messy, yes. And what I have no doubt that the leaders of my church felt scandalized and embarrassed that this had happened within our church. Well, it actually happened in private homes, but you know, the connections were made at our church. And we had lots of systems in place, background checks and all that, and it still happened. You know, because he'd never been arrested before. But I do think that that's an example that, you know, that's the model, that's best practice that churches should follow, is being really transparent with both the congregants and the criminal justice system.
Like being overly transparent, erring on the side of being extra transparent. And I will say too that I think one thing that's encouraged me is the Catholic Church has started making a lot of those changes themselves. And I appreciate that. I think it's necessary. We need to do much more as well. But that is the kind, I think the church should model that sort of, we should be that model of like health. Health and taking it seriously, even if it's messy and
All right, we'd love to hear your thoughts on sexual abuse in the church. Have you experienced anything like it at a church that you've been to? How did the church respond, and how do you feel about how they responded?